Welcome back, everybody, to the tournament at Gorlan, which is book 1 of the Ranger's Apprentice, the Early Years series. We're going to be in chapter 43 today, so let's go ahead and get into it. In his time, Erald had fought in hundreds of bouts, practice rounds, friendly tournaments, and deadly serious battles to the death. He instinctively knew the difference between a strike with a tournament lance, designed to shatter on contact, and fitted with a rounded wooden practice head, and a war lance, designed to penetrate and kill. Morgarath was using a war lance. There was a large puff of dust as the molded clay ball disguising the iron tip disintegrated. Then the iron head struck and held, biting deep into his shield, lodging there and gouging a jagged hole in the thin metal covering the wooden framework. The heavy oak shaft didn't bend and splinter as a tournament lance would have. It held firm, barely flexing, and driving the lethal iron warhead deep into the shield, hurling Erald back, the massive power of the strike driving his horse down onto its haunches as Morgarath rose in his stirrups, using his own weight and strength and momentum to drive the lance home even harder. Erald tried to kick his legs clear of the stirrups. Barnaby screamed in rage and pain and crashed over onto his side, trapping Erald's right leg underneath his massive body. Barnaby struggled to rise, but he was badly winded by the fall and the weight of his rider and saddle. Added to that was the fact that Barnaby had badly strained a fore-shoulder muscle as he was sent twisting to one side, leaving him kicking and struggling helplessly on his side, his rider trapped beneath him. Desperately, Erald tried to shove himself clear of the struggling horse, but the weight was too much. His left arm still retained the torn shield, and he held the horse's reins in his left hand. Realizing that if Barnaby made it to his feet, the threshing, iron-shod hoofs might well put an end to his life, Erald took the reins in both hands and held the horse down as he struggled to extricate himself. Time enough to let Barnaby up when he was clear, he thought. He craned round to see where Morgarath was, and saw the black-clad knight rounding the far end of the tilt and trotting his horse back toward him. He still had a few moments, he thought, thrusting despairingly with his left leg against the saddle to try to slip his right leg free. Morgarath was swinging down from the saddle. He drew his two-handed longsword from its scabbard with a ringing hiss of steel on leather. He shook the black and yellow shield from his left arm, discarding it on the grass. Then he turned to face the western grandstand. "A resultat final!" he shouted, reminding those watching of the agreed conditions of the duel. Then he began to run toward the stricken figure on the ground, raising the huge sword above his head in a two-handed grip as he went. Erald realized he had misjudged badly. Too late, he released his grip on the reins, but Barnaby was exhausted now by his struggles, and by the thundering charges he had delivered during the duel, and he lay, snorting and groaning, and refused to try to rise. The huge sword came down, hissing through the air, Erald lying helplessly, his own sword trapped somewhere underneath his body, had only the light jousting shield with which to defend himself. Desperately, he threw it up into the path of the descending longsword, and felt the heavy blade bite into the metal, tear through it, and shatter the wood beneath. The force of the blow drove the shield down against him. Morgarath struggled briefly to free the blade from the tangle of splintered wood and torn metal. With a final tug, he jerked it clear, breaking the shield's leather arm straps in the process, and sending it spinning across the field. Now Erald lay at his mercy. Morgarath brought the sword back again and swung it in a 45-degree arc, aiming to shear through Erald's shoulder where his neck joined his body. Erald saw it coming and shut his eyes, waiting for the end. But the blow never landed. Morgarath felt a jarring vibration up his arm, and heard a ringing crash of steel on steel as something intercepted his stroke, stopping it cold. He looked up from the helpless man, trapped under the horse, and saw another warrior had joined the battle. A tall man, wearing a red surcoat and glittering chain mail. A flat-topped, cylindrical helmet was set on his head, with a broad nasal reaching down to protect his nose and face, and conceal his features. His sword, a heavy-bladed cavalry sword, had intercepted Morgarath's killing stroke. His iron wrist had blocked the long blade, stopping it dead in mid-air, even though it had all of Morgarath's strength behind it. Morgarath screamed in rage and stepped back, pointing accusingly at the interloper. "You have no right," he screamed. "This is a duel of honor, and you cannot interfere." "There's no honor here," the other man replied. "You broke the rules of the tournament. You used a war lance with a killing head." His voice carried clearly to the grandstands on either side, and the crowd, which had grown silent at his intervention, began to buzz with comment. They had seen how Morgarath's lance hadn't shattered, how it had driven deep into Erald's shield, sending his horse staggering and falling. Now they understood why it had happened that way. But Morgarath wasn't about to give in easily. He turned and screamed toward his pavilion. "Crossbowmen! Shoot him down!" Tournament rules stated that 2 crossbowmen should always be on duty in case a combatant was seen to break the rules during a bout. Striking at an opponent's horse, or turning to attack an opponent from behind after a pass, was completed were 2 of the situations that would result in the transgressors being shot. Another rule forbade a third party taking a hand in the duel, as had just happened. Since Morgarath was the host of the tournament, the crossbowmen were his soldiers. Now they stepped forward and leveled their weapons at the red-clad knight facing their baron. "Rangers!" Morgarath looked round, confused at the cry. He saw a group of men, all wearing the distinctive mottled cloaks of the Ranger Corps, all with massive longbows, stepping clear of the public grandstand. "Drop the crossbows!" The same voice carried across the field, and the crossbowmen hesitated. They had heard the word Rangers. Now they saw 8 men in mottled green and gray cloaks, each one with a massive longbow leveled. These men, they realized, were real Rangers, not the ineffectual pretenders that their lord had been appointing over the past months. "Do it now," the voice added, and the crossbowmen set their bows down on the grass at their feet, backing away from them, their hands held in the air. "You cowards!" Morgarath screamed. "Shoot him down! I order you!" The 2 men exchanged a glance, then turned and ran. "He's broken the rules! He must die!" Morgarath ranted after them. But the red-clad stranger interrupted him in a voice that was audible around the field. "You can't break the rules of the tournament, then invoke them to suit yourself." His voice was vaguely familiar, and Morgarath regarded him through slitted eyes. "Who are you?" he demanded. The knight smiled at him, a grim smile, totally devoid of humor. Plunging his sword point into the ground, He reached with his right hand toward his shield. Morgarath realized now that the shield was covered with a thick linen overlay. The stranger released the retaining cord, and the linen fell away, revealing a red enameled shield. In the center, in a white circle, was the figure of a stooping red hawk, Prince Duncan's insignia. There was a gasp of surprise from the onlookers. "Duncan!" "Actually, that's Prince Duncan to you," Duncan told him. For a moment, Morgarath was taken aback. Then his devious mind found a way to turn the situation to his advantage. He pointed accusingly at the prince. "Then I name you traitor to the kingdom. You've been raiding across the border into Picta, looting and killing, and endangering our treaty with our northern neighbors. Lay down your sword and surrender, you traitor." Duncan shook his head slowly. He took hold of the sword, standing point down in the turf, and drew it clear. "Not going to happen, Morgarath," he said. The black-clad baron leapt toward him, swinging his vast sword in a horizontal stroke at rib height. It smashed into Duncan's shield with a ringing crash. But this was a war shield, not a light wood and metal piece designed for friendly tournaments. It was thick metal set over a solid hardwood frame, with a slightly convex shape to deflect an opponent's blows. The sword blade shrieked against the shield as it slid off, leaving a scar in the paint and a faint dent in the surface. And then Morgarath found himself fighting for his life. Duncan rained blow after blow on the tall baron, one stroke blending into another in a continuous barrage. Morgarath had no shield, and the long sword was a heavy and cumbersome weapon. It took all his mighty strength to position it for each parry, and he was left with no time to attempt a counterstroke. He gave ground slowly, backing away from the relentless storm of blows, seeing Duncan's sword as a glittering wheel of light, striking at him first from one direction, then another. His breath was coming in short gasps, and fear struck deep in his heart as he realized that he was outmatched. For the first time, he was facing a swordsman who was just as powerful as he was, but faster and more skilled. They moved back along the tournament ground, their swords clashing in a continuous, ringing, shrieking din. Then, as Morgarath had backed almost all the way toward his own pavilion, Duncan caught him with his sword momentarily lowered and struck down at it, beating it from Morgarath's grasp and sending it thudding to the turf. The black-clad knight held up both hands in a gesture of surrender. "Wait!" he shouted, expecting Duncan to simply continue with a coup de grace. But the prince stopped, his sword pointing at Morgarath's throat. "What is it?" Duncan said. Morgarath heaved a shuddering sigh of relief. He looked around to the grandstand. The barons assembled there had risen from their seats. Some had even begun to move toward the tournament field itself. Morgarath's next words were pitched to the onlookers. "I still call you traitor, and I demand the right to speak in front of the barons assembled here." He raised his voice and beckoned to the nobles in the grandstand. "My lords, join us, please. We have vital business to discuss." As the various noblemen began to descend from the grandstand and make their way to the end of the tournament ground, where Morgarath and Duncan faced each other, Duncan realized the moment was lost. A second ago, he could have killed Morgarath, and claimed it was done in the heat of battle. Now, after Morgarath's appeal to the assembled nobles, such an act would be regarded as cold-blooded murder. Morgarath glanced around and saw Teasel hovering nearby. He beckoned him closer and whispered, Get the proclamation. He had been planning to reveal the proclamation after his bout with Erald. Now, he realized, it could still be a deciding factor for him. Teasel nodded and turned away, but Morgarath's hand on his arm stopped him. The Baron of Gorlan leaned closer and said in a lower tone, "And assemble our men." As Teasel hurried away, Morgarath turned back to face the group of nobles. Behind them, members of the general public were also streaming onto the field, crowding around the group of barons and knights, jostling for a better view. That suited Morgarath. He was a skilled rabble-rouser, and the fake Duncan's exploits had eroded the prince's popularity and credibility with the common people. Duncan saw that most of the barons present had gathered around them. He decided not to wait for Morgarath. He sensed that the man had some stratagem in mind. "Morgarath, I accuse you of breaking the rules of your own tournament and attempting to murder Baron Erald of Redmont," he said in a firm, clear voice. "And I counter-accuse you, Prince Duncan, of attempting to murder your own father, King Oswald, and of raiding and murdering in the north. I accuse you of breaking our treaty with the people of Picta and risking all-out war, and I accuse you of treason against the crown and demand that you face the death penalty." And that's going to be the end of Chapter 43. Once again, thank you for joining me, thank you for listening, and I will look forward to seeing you all next time in Chapter 44. God bless, and have a good one.